Okay, we have been talking about arguments and about how to recognize and represent them. Today, we're going to work through an example drawn from a book chapter in which we'll find a couple of arguments. However, the arguments do not occur in isolation, but are situated within the context given by the goals and strategies of the author of the chapter. The text is taken from the book Practical Ethics, authored by Peter Singer. We're going to take a look at the text to determine how it is organized in terms of its goals and the means it used to achieve those goals. We're also going to find arguments put forward to defend certain conclusions. Now, we consider analysis as occurring at various levels. At a global level, we're going to ask questions about the text as a whole, such as, well, what is the author's main thesis? What is the author's purpose? Right? What is the main argument for the thesis? Now, it is possible to answer these questions after a relatively careful first reading, and the answers you give to them are going to be useful to determine the point of the arguments we'll find there. We're also going to pay attention to more specific parts of the text, and we are going to see what's going on paragraph by paragraph. We're going to ask what function the paragraph is playing and what its main point is. There are certain ways in which authors convey how their ideas are organized in the text. One way is by dividing it in separate sections, each with its own title and subsection, and so on. Another is simply to give the reader guideposts along the way. Among these guideposts, we have the following. Some are order indicators, such as in the first case, or I will start by. For instance, in a text you might read the author saying, there are 3 reasons to believe Q, where Q is any statement. First, so on and so on. Second, so on and so on. Third, so on and so on. Then we have argument indicators, which we have already studied. And if you remember, some of them were conclusion indicators and some were premise indicators. We also have expressions of contrast, which convey some sort of opposition between ideas. For example, you have nevertheless, however, but, whereas. In an example in a phrase is, well, X's objection to Q says, blah, blah, blah. However, Y has replied to this objection by arguing that. And as we saw in a previous topic, you see that they are often used in discounting, right? These diamonds are expensive, but they're really beautiful. There are expressions that indicate an addition to or the continuation of an idea or line of thought. Examples are moreover, furthermore, in addition, etc. Then we also have expressions that introduce instances or examples or illustration of a point that has been made. So we have, for instance, an example of this. This is illustrated by, and the abbreviation EG, which in Latin means exempli gratia, that is, for the sake of example. So you have, in a particular context, there are different ways X might respond to this argument. For instance, X could say that, blah, blah, blah. So here we have an example in which several of those guideposts occur together. See if you can identify them. We have seen that none of W's replies to X's argument succeed. In addition, it has been shown that W's thesis has undesirable consequences. The first consequence was, the second was. Hence, we should reject W's claim that P. Nevertheless, the claim that P is still widely accepted in the literature. So here we see, in addition, it has been shown that. First, second, hence, nevertheless. To the previous, we have to add other things that we have studied, such as the language occurring in assuring, in garden, in discounting, and the use of evaluative language, which tell us the attitude that the author is taken towards a given material, or that somebody that the author is quoting has. Okay, the text is called Experimenting on Animals. And here is the first passage. Now read it once, and if you want, you can pause the video. But ask yourself, so what is this paragraph doing? What is its function, its goal? Now you can see that this passage is setting out the main topic and the relevance for the discussion that is going on in the book. And so the topic is animal experiment, which, as is pointed out there, is relevant for the discussion of speciesism. Now, reading this, you might be wondering what the author understands by speciesism. Well, speciesism, according to Singer, is a prejudice or bias in favor of the interests of members of one's own species and against those of members of other species. Okay, back to the paragraph. The highlighted words indicate expressions that are important for determining the structure of the text. You can see perhaps that is a guarding term because that introduces a premise or reason. And in particular, what follows is the support for the claims made in the previous two sentences. If this is so, introduces a conditional statement, which might be a premise in an argument. Moreover, the this occurring after the if indicates that the first part of the conditional, that is, whatever is between the if and the then, that is, that the first part of the conditional is to be found in a previous sentence. For instance, now here they're going to present a specific example of some general point that was recently discussed. And so the point is that, well, here they are explaining the relevance of this section, that is, on experimenting on animals, for the problem at large, which is the discussion of speciesism. So we can see that some claims are being made. First, that the issue of speciesism stands out starkly in the use of animals in experiments, and indeed that perhaps this is the area in which speciesism is most clearly observed. Also, that this is because experimenters often seek to justify experimenting on animals by claiming that the experiments lead us to discoveries about humans. Now read the second paragraph, and again, if you want, you can pause the video. Now here, Singer is laying out one common argument that is used to support the practice that he's going to attack, that is animal experiments. Thus, this is an argument that he is going to challenge. It seems that the argument in question depends on weighing benefits and drawbacks, right? This is clear when he says that the justification depends on whether the experiments relieve more suffering than they cause. And so he starts to challenge this line of thought by means of examples which intend to show that the drawbacks are more important than is usually thought. So we have the examples drawn from shampoo, cosmetics, and food additives. So the key sentence here is when it says, this comfortable belief is mistaken. And which belief is he talking about? Well, the belief that all animal experiments serve vital medical purposes and can be justified on the grounds that they relieve more suffering than they cause. Right? This is what comes before. And what follows after this sentence are the reasons against such belief. Right? And the conclusion that he wants to establish is that, well, it is not the case that all animal experiments serve vital medical purposes and that can be justified on the grounds that they relieve more suffering than they cause. The premises, well, it's all the rest, including the examples that he cites. Here we have the third paragraph. So we can see that the paragraph continues the same theme as the previous ones. So we see the occurrence of nevertheless, right? And this establishes a sort of contrast between what came before and what's to follow. Now, which contrast? presumably between the reasons given in the previous passage against the justification of the practice and what follows, namely the fact that companies kept on doing the experiments. And what is next is a series of examples. Now, when we come across a list of examples, we have to pay attention to what comes after the list, which is going to comment on the significance of the examples. So what follows, the payoff of going through the examples, is this, namely that these tests are not necessary to prevent human suffering. And what this does is reinforce the preliminary conclusion given in the previous paragraph. And what follows seeks to strengthen it more. It says that even in the case in which the experiments were indispensable, in the case of shampoo or food colorants, there are already enough on the market, etc. And here we have the fourth paragraph. So in this paragraph, we're being given more examples. So we see also the occurrence of an evaluative term, such as atrocious, right? Negative evaluative term, which shows the author's attitudes towards some of the experiments. And also this occurrence of this is supposed, right? The way this indicates that the author is going to take distance from what is being said. And here is paragraph 5, which gives more examples, but this time not from the industry or from the military, but from academia. And here we have the last paragraph. And here the author is driving home the message of the chapter. And here we are presented with another argument. You can see that hence is an argument marker since it introduces a conclusion. So we can see that we're told, well, the benefits of the experiments to humans are either non-existent or uncertain, and the losses to members of other species are certain and real. This is a premise. Then the conclusion, marked by hence, is that these experiments indicate a failure to give equal consideration to the interests of all beings, irrespective of species. But remember that this is Singer's definition of speciesism, so that what he's effectively saying is that these experiments somehow evince or indicate speciesism. Let's go back and see if we can identify the arguments and extract them from the text. The first paragraph I show you contains a couple of arguments, which I leave to you to work out. So let's proceed on to the second paragraph. We said that the author here lays out one common argument that is used to support animal experiments and which he's going to attack. Right? So this argument, again, was based on weighing benefits and drawbacks. These two sentences express the beliefs that Singer attributes to people. I want to focus on the second because, as it is stated, it explicitly concerns the justification. Right? We're talking about the moral justification here for natural experiments. And so the belief is that animal experiments are justified on the grounds that they relieve more suffering than they cause. Notice that this is a mini argument. If we add a comma after justified, this will be easier to see. So we're being told that animal experiments are justified, and the reason for that is that they relieve more suffering than they cause. So here we're giving a conclusion and a premise. So we can set them in this order, where we have the premise and then the conclusion. Notice that this is not an argument that Singer is endorsing. Rather, it is an argument that he's going to criticize. Also, it looks like there is something else that has been left implicit in the statement of the argument. So far, it is unclear what the relation is between the conclusion and the premise. And what is it that links the two? Now, that has to be a general principle, right? Now, the reason for these additions will hopefully be clearer later in the course. Something like this would do the job. If animal experiments relieve more suffering than they cause, then they are justified. So with the new numeration, we have the following argument, where the first premise is tacit. 1. If animal experiments relieve more suffering than they cause, then they are justified. 2. Animal experiments relieve more suffering than they cause. Therefore, animal experiments are justified. We could also represent the argument graphically, like this. This means that premises 1 and 2 together support the conclusion, or lead to it. And indeed, it seems that if the premises were true, then the conclusion would have to be true as well. So if you accept 1 and 2, you have to accept 3. Otherwise, you would be contradicting yourself. But notice that both premises have to be true in order for the conclusion to follow. So, the most obvious way of challenging this argument is by questioning the truth of at least one of the premises. It looks like Singer is willing to accept, even for the sake of argument, the first premise. So, his objections are directed towards premise 2, since that's the point of all the examples he mentions. Now, the intended conclusion that animal experiments are justified is no longer supported by the premises. That is, if Singer is correct, right? Since at least one of them is false. And again, this way of evaluating arguments will be clearer later. So this is how Singer seeks to neutralize what he sees as a popular argument in favor of animal experiments. Now we can take care of the argument that occurs in the 6th paragraph, and which is Singer's unpositive argument. So the previous argument criticized some arguments in favor of animal experimentation. Now here, Singer is doing something more direct, right? He's going to offer an argument against animal experimentation. Notice that hence here is a conclusion marker, and so whatever follows it constitutes the conclusion, and what comes earlier is premise material. Paraphrasing a bit, we are left with this argument. So we have a premise that says, in animal experiments, the benefits to humans are uncertain or inexistent, and the harm to non-human animals are real and certain. And then the conclusion, which is that animal experimentation does not assign equal value to the interests of humans and to those of non-human animals. Again, this might not always be necessary, but we might want, for completeness' sake, to add a tacit premise, so as to tighten the relation between the premise and the conclusion. And it's a premise that, well, we can be pretty sure that is being assumed by Singer. And I say that sometimes it is useful because you might want to criticize not the explicit premise, but the implicit premise that the argument builds upon. Now, this premise would express the underlying principle linking the outcomes of animal experiments and the value assigned to the interests of animals. And again, this is a possibility. If, for a given practice, the benefits to humans are uncertain or inexistent, and the harm to non-human animals are real and certain, then that practice does not assign equal value to the interests of humans and to those of human animals. So we can say that this is the first premise. And then we add the other premise and the conclusion. And here we have a graphical representation of the argument, in which we also show that the justification for premise 2 was found in the examples offered in the text. Okay, so this is all for now. Bye.